going to get started with another Miller Prize finalist panel discussion. We get to meet 4 more Miller Prize finalists. I'm really excited about this. This session is presented by Indiana University. Of course, Indiana University is here in town with the IU Center for Art and Design. We're grateful for all of their sponsorship throughout this symposium. And today's Miller Prize panel discussion will feature 4 teams and 4 folks. But first, I'm going to invite up the stage Kelly Wilson, who will moderate the panel and sort of explain to us how things are going to go. Kelly Wilson is the director of the IU Center for Art and Design and has been in Columbus for the past 5 years. Kelly, can I welcome you onto stage?
Good afternoon. Morning. Where are we? Somewhere close to afternoon. I'm happy to introduce to you, and I'd ask our commentators to please come up and take seats. Benjamin Ball of Ball-Nogues. His practice is a combination of art, architecture, industrial design out of LA. Eric Höweler of Höweler and Yoon, in a Boston-based practice where they combine art, architecture, and embedded technologies. Marklee of Marklee and Jonathan Olivares, please come up because they're working together. Marklee of Johnston Marklee, both practices in LA and multi forms of practice, I should say. And Jennifer Wu and Dwayne Oliver, please come up. Take your seat. Another practice out of Los Angeles. You can see we have a heavy West Coast presence with us today. So I am happy to introduce these folks to you today. This is the last set of our panelists, commentators on panels. And this is an opportunity for you to hear how they speak about design, their thoughts relevant to what we've just heard. And it's a way for them to also hear us and listen to this city. The exhibition at the center shows their work that exemplifies and characterizes the kind of work that they do, and you're invited to visit the gallery to see the work they make. And in these questions we'll ask them today, I hope we can sort of help you find out more how they think, how they respond, and what their imagination process is. And I want to start by saying that the conversation we just listened to is one that technology, fabrication, the rational process of trying to actually put something together and solve it has long been part of the way a designer, an artist thinks. It inhabits our minds, and it challenges us to new creations. This conversation goes back and forth between inventions made by technology and inventions made by designers independent of technology. And I think of several things. One, the Pantheon was only possible because of concrete, which was newly created because of a fine sand, a mozzarella, that they could make the concrete with that would cure underwater. And with this came these remarkable spans and a dome that is still the largest, I believe, spanning dome in the world. If it wasn't without that invention, you couldn't have made this thing. Oh, thank you, Richard. And yet, there are challenges that come. I know that Wolfgang Watts is a scholar, and he wrote a remarkable essay. It's in a collection of writings called Studies of the Italian Renaissance. And in the chapter called The Evolution of the Section Drawing in the Italian Renaissance, he traces the change in the ways that architects learned to draw, because his thesis was inventions brought to the way we draw things changed the conceptions of space architects were to come up with. And he runs it from Alberti through Brunelleschi's crowd all the way through to Raphael. And the conception that changed, he argues, was that inventions made to how we represented stuff caused space to move in completely different ways in the imaginations of architects. The parallel that we just heard this morning was that the inventions made with materials and our assembly processes and how to think about them provide equal provocations to the human imagination. So I'm going to, and these have happened so rapidly, and so it happened so much at this time, that I thought I would ask Mark, if you have a practice that has been cooking since 1998, and you have probably witnessed more change in the method by which we might go about assembling and thinking about the role of assembly and fabrication plays in how our thought processes. Would you be good enough to talk a little bit about what you might have seen in the transition from your earliest practice to the practice you now have?
Well, I think certainly what I've seen is reflected in the amount of gray hair I have in the last 18 years. But I think I'm still a bit overwhelmed by being here and in Columbus, Indiana, a place I've known for a long time, but only been here for the first time since last night. I'm a bit overwhelmed by being in this Saarinen church and Pei across the street. I'm thinking about this idea of this notion about delay.
Notion about what?
Delay.
Delay.
Delaying, yeah. I.M. Pei did this interview in 1980, I believe, on this TV show with Barbara Lee Diamondstein, where he talked about Brunelleschi, and he said Brunelleschi built the hospital in Florence, the Innocenti Hospital.
The Foundling Hospital, yes.
And about 100 years later, Michelozzo built another building next door, and across the street, Sangallo the Elder built another building, which is almost exactly the same. And I.M. Pei said, that's civilized. And I thought there was a fascinating idea about this kind of notion of being civilized, and seeing how Pei reacted to Saarinen's church. And also being here in Saarinen's church, it makes me think about how modernism arrived in Scandinavia pretty late, pretty much delayed in my mind, because of maybe the embrace of Nordic classicism, because of the longevity of national romanticism. But when it arrived in Scandinavia, it arrived in a very refined and mature way. And I see this continuation happening here. Both buildings are quite subdued and have a very reticent type of temperament, but a lot of richness are there. And this somehow extends to what I'm thinking of in terms of technology, how technology could be at certain times delayed, at least in my own practice. I think certainly as when we started our work, our opportunities are relegated to smaller buildings. Now we're working on slightly larger or mid-sized buildings, and we deal with different contingencies, different budgets, and different caliber of fabricators that we work with. And that certainly has changed. I would say, I think we've always tried to adopt a certain way of not so much using the latest technology, but technology or ways of fabrication that has been around, but maybe think about new ways of using them. I think it started off even earlier in our Hill House, where this material of grail coat has been used for industrial roofing for 25, 30 years, but just hasn't been really used for cladding of the entire building. And we use that, so it's almost like using things that has been around, but perhaps in a different way.
Different ways, yes. I would ask a similar question to Jenny and Dwayne. In your practice in LA, have you, much of the discussion also centered around the way in which collaboration works between those who assemble, make the things you invent. Do you find that this relationship, you've been able with your practice use this collaboration, or is that inflected difference in how you think about making your work, or has it changed the way in which, have you challenged fabricators to accommodate visions that they can't quite? I'd like to learn about how you guys have engaged the people that assemble this remarkable buildings that you guys make, right, in your installations.
Well, when we first started, we were making things because we had to ourselves. And I think we went into it feeling like if we wanted them built in the way we were imagining them, we simply didn't have budgets to get them done through other people. And so we started out without a larger intention other than let's make them happen. But we went into that, and increasingly we would go at them with more and more gusto, and the more we did that, the more we felt like we were removing ourselves from the possibility of having someone else do them. And we got very worried that at some point the translation, let me back up a little bit. Because we were deeply involved in the fabrication of the pieces, we were learning that being involved in them made them better. We could extend the design process, we were more intimately involved in the materials, and we learned what they did in richer ways.
You guys
we were literally building
doing the work that you were designing.
The things that we were doing.
So like one-to-one, almost like a sculptor.
Absolutely. I mean, we still do it today. And the more we did that, the more we became nervous that at some point these things would have to get translated to other people, and we would lose an aspect that came with being able to build them ourselves. And I think as other people have begun building the projects now, we found some successes, and we know there are some problems. I think that what's happened is like the comments about workflow. I really liked some of the comments in the earlier session about needing to find new ways to work, because it is very difficult, particularly with smaller projects without enormous budgets, to get experimentation to become a part of the early phase of the project. And it's that experimentation that is the difference between a project being truly interesting and it being a kind of realization of an early stage of a rendering. And so what we've done is we've tried to invent new ways to communicate to clients. We've literally made videos in place of drawings at times. Just to address your point about drawing, we've moved directly from digital into fabrication. We've tried to do things. As someone, I draw a lot. I have found that the role of drawing in communicating the kind of projects that we often do is getting more and more difficult to do. So we've tried to be as inventive about the way we communicate to contractors as we have about the actual things we're making.
Maybe I can talk from a different perspective. The last 3 years, I've been working on a line of wearable pieces. And it's kind of like...
In fact, I think you're wearing one of your pieces
I'm
now.
wearing one of them. I think of it as architecture on the body, and I've been collaborating, and this is mainly just me as a single designer, and collaborating with really some of the largest 3D printing companies in the world. And there were times when they would send me a piece of gooey something, and they say, can you design something with this? Like, what can I do with it? And I would be like, well, I would actually give them feedback. I was like, this is too gooey to be a necklace because of like these criteria. And we would go back and forth and figuring out like how to actually improve the type of material that they're prototyping, with like 100 engineers. So it's been a really interesting perspective because when we were talking earlier about the role of the designer and and the tools that we are using, at the end it is, I really feel like I have the control of understanding what these tools can do and what are the material properties and how I can contribute to this this whole endeavor, and how I can then invent something new from all of this technology. So.
Thank you. Benjamin, you have I think you told me it was a 4,000 square foot fabricating shop as part of your practice. So you swim very closely between what you might imagine as a design and how it would be fabricated, because you're doing the fabrication and experimenting. I would love you to talk about that process that you do in your practice.
We're a fabricator, but while we do it I think I share some of the same challenges that Dwayne and Jenny did in the beginning, and that we were building things ourselves because there weren't other people available to do it, and it would have been too expensive. But we've really developed a methodology that we can't really depart from at this point, where we're looking to create production methodologies and then trying to find a purpose for them. So the process of prototyping, the process of making, precedes the process of design. It is the design. It's the design of the production method. And then in that vacuum that comes out of this kind of pure interest in the production, we look for applications and ways of applying it. As our projects get more programmatic and we're asked to actually, and we're stepping out of galleries, now we're asked to fulfill a programmatic objective. So that changes the way that we work, and so we're still sort of in developing ways of dealing with that. So now I have to go back to being sort of the kind of person that I was when I was working for other architects. Okay, here's a problem, we need to, we can start from the sort of big picture, the 4B pencil sketch, and refine it down to how it's produced. So, you know, as we get bigger, those types of issues become more part of what we have to deal with every day.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, if anyone is close, and you do a great deal of design research, and as a designer, and there's a wonderful book out, published in 2011 on chairs. I think it's 200 chairs, is that right?
Taxonomy of office chairs.
Okay. But there's 200 examples, are there not?
210 chairs.
Yes. Is it true that when you go to contemplate the invention of something at the scale of a chair, on the artifacts you create, that the fabricating process and materiality must be very foremost in your head as you start this process?
Absolutely. I mean, I think furniture, that scale comes first from a material process. So, I mean, it's really, I also, like Mark, feel quite humbled here, but in the back here and also the pews you're sitting on are an early example of furniture done by Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen, which was a collaboration that eventually split off and gave us these amazing chairs and many others. But it's really interesting that, you know, here that they're working with wood, and wood is a local material, and they have these incredible beams of, or slats of uninterrupted wood that you're all sitting on now. And this is, you know, it's a technique that is somehow, you know, connected to an area, to a site. And like that, I think I tend to rely on almost what I would call like journalistic tactics. I think that's where some of the writing and research that I do in my practice transfers over to the manufacture of objects, is that I use those journalistic tactics to sort of sniff out interesting production techniques, and then learn the language of those production techniques. And really, they are like language, and once you sort of start to look at them as a kind of prose, then you can start to make advancements within those existing materials. It's not necessarily about inventing, in my practice, new materials per se, but using those existing materials, learning the language of those materials, and then translating that over to an archetype, whether that's a bench or a chair or...
Great, thank you. Eric, I know that your practice with Mijing embraces fabrication, new fabrication technologies, and startling and embedded things. Could you talk about how that's related to your creative process?
I guess I just wanted to point out a kind of generational thing. I think there is a kind of generation here represented that sort of has been working with these digital tools. Probably when we graduated, we were probably the last ones to sort of draw by hand, and then the first to take up these tools. And I think that's what sort of binds everyone together here. I do think, you know, the previous panel we saw was just a kind of half a generation up, and I imagine there's some people here that are half a generation down. But I do think the discussion that happened earlier about trying to match the architect's vision or whatever, I totally think that the architects need to change their vision in order to sort of think through the tool. And I think that's the difference, I think, with a generation that's designing.
What would that vision shift be? What's the before or after? What's the difference you're seeing?
Yeah, I didn't like the idea that there's a line that we have to somehow match, and that the fabricators are struggling to sort of match that line. I feel like the person who drew that line should have thought through the process to the point where there's a kind of integration of a process in the production of that line. So anticipating a kind of fabrication process, or being familiar enough with that fabrication process such that your vision can sort of incorporate those things seems much more productive than someone sort of in a room sort of modeling something and then some fabricator trying to collaborate to match that vision. So I think the thing that I think is most exciting about all the designers here is that there's a kind of a kind of natural sort of integration of that kind of thinking before the design even happens. So it's not about a post-production trying to match something, but a kind of ingestion, an integration of that kind of making thinking into the way we design.
So, thank you. The panel before us discussed with some length the interest and the necessity for a different form of workflow, was one thing that was questioned, and the integration of collaboration between different types of people who contribute eventually to the making of a project. So, Mark, could I ask you to, let me put this question again, that do you find in your practice that there is, are there new forms of collaboration that you're engaged in or aware of? And if so, could you give us an example of something you thought was successful?
I would probably like to think about that a little bit more first, but I agree a lot with what Eric just said. You know, I think I was thinking of what Fabio Gramazio just presented in the earlier session. I was always impressed by the work, and I like very much how they apply the technology to the making itself. You know, I think maybe our generation, the last generation to draw, and then when the first digital generation came about, we witnessed a lot of people that use new technology, not so much for construction, but for the representation of design. You know, so there's like 3 steps removed, you know, and I see what Fabio is doing is much more direct. I still have this question in my mind in terms of the necessity for this synergy between form and fabrication. You know, I think like in the case of Fabio's examples, you know, there's something that informed the making of that totem pole at the biennial last year, but there's something else that informed the form itself, and I can imagine that being detached and being equally as potent. You know, from a polemic standpoint, I could also imagine it be a completely classical arch, but manufactured the same way, but create a very different kind of primitive feel. You know, so I think this generation we feel less of this. I think less of this urgency to demonstrate the prowess of the tool, than use the tool for have a more closer synergy with the form or the conception of the form. And I think that's what I'm thinking in terms of this slight delay, you know, that happens in this type of architecture where we're in right now.
It's the tension between. Think of the example in. Was it in 1290 AD in Florence? Was it Arnaldo di Gambio puts the foundations of the church in the ground to a church so large that they don't know how to span the roof. I would have loved to have been in the room with the cardinal, and the architect, the cardinal says, "What do you got?" "Oh, it's so good." "How good?" "Oh, it's a very good." "How good?" "Oh, because it's so big." "How big?" "Oh, it's a very big." "How big?" "I can't put the roof on." "Let's do it." Right. Almost 200 years later, they put the roof on. Like, who thinks their culture's going to be around in 200 years for that? So, and of course, Brunelleschi gets associated with the church and the dome and et cetera, that some things we attempt are outsized in our efforts to actually accomplish it. But we think of this because our aspirations lead us this way. So I will turn the question back to you guys. Do you have that experience where you think of things that you want to make, that technology or fabrication sort of isn't there yet? Or do you think that you're in the zone where this is now very possible?
By the way, Kelly, just to, you know, there was another solution that was proposed but not adopted before Brunelleschi came, which was to fill the entire church with
dirt.
mud.
With dirt, yes.
With dirt, and then
filled
as
with
a
coins.
formwork. But then the problem is, how do you remove it?
Yes.
And then so someone proposed that why don't you hide some coins inside the dirt so that the children of Florence would kind of dig it out for free. I thought that was a great solution. Yeah. That's a great
This sort of raises the question about whether, you know, form inspires technology, technology inspires form. I mean, it's that game that goes back and forth.
I generally don't think we think in that way. I think that at some point in our career, we asked ourselves, where are we going to be most effective? Is it going to be as kind of visionaries waiting for a material to find, you know, to figure out ways to build our work? Or are we going to work right at the edge of where technology exists and make the most of that. And I think we decided that's where we're most effective. That's where architects can make a difference today. And particularly in an age where the production of image and shape and form is everywhere. The people that are actually making a difference in our minds are the people who are figuring out how to exist right on the edge. I want to answer a little bit of that question about the issue of workflow. Not to point any blame, and in a way it's as much the architects to blame as it is, say, the construction industry. But at some point, there's an issue that architects tiptoe around, and it is antithetical to what is being called for from fabricators early this morning, and that is architects tiptoe around this means and methods issue. For anyone who's not an architect, architectural contracts today essentially say that architects should not define the means and methods by which the things we make are built. And it is a very, very sensitive issue because it defines who becomes liable in the end for the work that is done. But what the fabricators are calling for is that we become closer to that thing. And the majority of us up here are people who are intimately involved in that, in the making of smaller projects with less liability. So how we make that jump to larger projects and still play a role in the means and methods by which these are built, and I think all of us believe that we have ideas about how that could happen better, is going to it will rely on some kind of change within the industry that allows us to become a part of that. Right now, they are essentially the intermediary that is allowing that to happen because they're taking on a fair amount of liability that we contractually don't have. Fabricators.
The fabricators. So
right.
The means and ways and means is the designation that you can't tell you can tell a contractor by contract this has to be there, but you can't tell them how to get it there. That's up to them. And this is what we're referring to. Yes. So I heard some nodding of heads. Could we have some more comments about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the projects we finished last year was this stone arch.
The memorial
at
in
MIT.
in MIT.
And that was we conceptualized it as a kind of missing figure, like it was memorializing a police officer that was killed, and so the kind of hollowing out of something was important. And then very, very quickly decided that it should be solid stone and thinking about it as a compression arch. And then figuring out how to build a compression arch today was quite a challenge. We had lots of engineers, 5 structural engineers, some of them interested in masonry, some of them used to steel. And the contractors came on and said, we'll make it out of steel and we'll clad it with stone. And we said, no, the poetics of the arch is that every stone is necessary to sort of be stable. So working through that with fabricators, with contractors, with the scaffold engineer, with the foundation engineer. I think that was what was required to build something that was 1,000 years old, but absolutely contemporary, because it required a 5-axis robot to cut the stone. So this question of means and methods is absolutely the opportunity. It's the third rail. It's where everything is, because as soon as you tell a contractor how to do it, you're implicated. But if you don't get involved, then they'll skin it with veneer, So, or the client might, or who knows?
We think a lot about the dynamics of power in the construction business, in the making business, and what Dwayne is talking about, liability is a big issue, but it's also, I think, about where in the power structure the designer is located. Because on the one hand, you can be, if you're defining the means and materials and methods, but then you're handing them to somebody, that person then is able to capitalize on them. And if they execute it, typically it becomes their kind of intellectual property. Whereas if you actually do it yourself, you own it, your enterprise can essentially be a black box walled off from the meddling fingers of general contractors and clients. And I'm not sure exactly where that goes, but I think it's worth sort of noting, that beyond liability, you have these this topic of intellectual property and what it means for a designer to own a process versus owning a design. I mean, patent law is set up so that a company like Cummins is, I'm guessing, but if they're like a lot of companies I've had contact with, if they own their production process, the method of making it, that's far more valuable than owning a shape or a style. For us, we're sort of interested in the former, the sort of utility patent. While we don't file for patents, it's very challenging for anybody to sort of replicate our process and some of the things that we've done, because so much energy there's so many layers of knowledge that are applied to, say, the string installations that we do. And people will say, well, they keep doing those string installations, but I'm like, but every year we do one, we sort of develop a richer understanding. It becomes more and more streamlined, the process, and it becomes more and more automatic for us. Whereas if I were to ask somebody else to try to do it, they would have to go through the 7 years to get to that point.
Jonathan, this must resonate somewhat with you. You sit in a very similar arc of work and responsibility.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this this arch problem, and I think like what happens in most furniture projects I've worked on is that it's really an adventure, with a collaborative adventure with the engineers and the manufacturers, and it's really, when you start out with a kind of radical idea, oftentimes, as well versed as you can be in that technology, like you haven't done it yet. So there's a huge process of back and forth and troubleshooting and understanding that some things are impossible or too expensive or too heavy or limited in some capacity. And so slowly there's this kind of negotiation between the engineers, between the factories, and you end up at something that's sort of somehow feasible or irreducible within the set of circumstances. So like I'll give you a good example with a project, an aluminum chair, which I did for Knoll. There we started out wanting to work with like hydroforming because we wanted to kind of bring back contoured metal seating for outdoors. So the whole premise was, well, let's revisit. In fact, there was a chair done 40 years ago by Richard Sapper and Marco Zanuso, and it was a stamped metal chair. But somehow in that time period, it was too expensive. It was made in steel, so steel rusts. And there were a lot of reasons why that chair didn't work out in its time, but we thought, let's revisit that process and that technique. So while we started with the idea of forming thin sheets of metal, gradually you start to realize that even today that's still extremely expensive, and assembling those things are extremely expensive. And so even with the backing of a company like Knoll, they start to push you towards other structural supports. So slowly we discover, we kind of introduce some die-cast supports in there. So you have some bones and some skin, and then the difficulty became joining those two surfaces. So then we went to 3M, and it was all about glues, and we were going to have to invest in a robot that could glue the chairs because the glue dries so quickly. So there again, we were at a chair that was like 4 times as expensive as we could possibly want. And so out of frustration, I think in the kind of go, no-go meeting, out of frustration, I just said, well, why can't we die-cast the whole thing? And the engineer from the die-casting supplier said, I mean, of course, the sheet metal former was really unhappy about that comment. but the die-casting supplier said, well, yeah, sure, why not? And so they sent us engine components that have like 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter thin skins of die casting. So then we were able to shift into that, 3 years into the process, say, okay, let's adopt this other technique. And so then we were able to dial in the weight but it was really a learning process and an adventure that took a long technical development that couldn't have happened. I mean, maybe if I were smarter, I would have had this idea from the beginning, but it took a time of development.
You beautifully described this, and also in the scale with which you're working, this comes to the fore real fast right away, and with the material you think of. Mark, in the architectural, the built projects you've done, I can look at some remarkable roofs and spans and things you achieve with your spaces of your buildings. I know that there seems to be, am I right, there's some traditional construction involved with your work, but also there's some unique moments that you must have relied upon specialization or understanding of materials and fabrication in some way that had to solve things you were thinking of. Could you kindly talk about that?
Yeah, I would start with responding also to something that Dwayne and Benjamin brought up. I think this whole notion of relationship between designer and fabricator is a very interesting question to me, because I'm curious, this model of like singer-songwriter, if you do both, how long does it last? Or how as your office and your project scale changes, like where are the most efficacious moments where this model works the best? I can imagine fabrication, small-scale projects, it works very well. And then very large projects, it works very well. I'm thinking of like Gary proving that, hey, I can build it cheaper and more efficient than Dworsky, you know. So the question, I think the question I'm facing right now is that when you deal with mid-sized projects, how do you do that? Because mid-sized projects is much less, like if it's a $300 million project, it's much easier to invest in something because a new type of technology, because there's a much larger scope of effect on the building. But mid-sized projects, they're not. You know, I'm curious how.
Well, I mean,
like
that
many of us,
you guys sit in that zone
yeah,
too.
that's exactly actually when the bills were presenting, I leaned over to Eric and I said, "Have you worked with them on a project yet?" And we've been now, you know, after 10 years of working, we like to think we can graduate from, you know, doing fabrication all ourselves and having project that has, you know, in most cases have decent budgets, but not decent enough to be one of these iconic buildings like the SF MoMA where they have enormous budgets. So every time we skirt with the idea of hiring one of them, and then we go in and really enthusiastic, and then we come back and the budget, we're like, that's our entire building budget. So it is a question whether, you know, how do we get into that mid-scale? Do architects take on like more, or do fabricators, are there sort of in-between fabricators, or will the technology become more affordable, or more people having the expertise? I don't know.
Yeah, I've talked about this with everyone all weekend, is making that jump to, the guys who were up here today, they are absolutely, you know, they're building some of the most astounding things on the planet today. And between where we're at and where they are is an enormous, enormous jump to make. And a lot of it, aside from the fabrication issues, that I often think about just the nature of experimentation, what it means to experiment architecturally today, and what it takes to fabricate that. You've seen, for one, the idea that so many of us are involved in installations, or even the idea that installations are the thing we're all competing for at this point. That didn't exist for architects 20 years ago. It's really changed. And it partially has to do with the fact that the level of complexity and the role of the digital tools and this material revolution that's happened has made it much more difficult to accomplish some of these ideas. And so you're not seeing, for example, small houses as the primary tool for architectural experimentation today.
Where small houses for a lot of American architecture, the history could be traced.
Absolutely, absolutely. Through the 80s, really. But the really significant houses today, the number of them has decreased dramatically. So you're seeing a lot of significant experimentation happening on the installation level. And then you're seeing it way up at the Frank Gehry level. But in between, very difficult to do, both because of budget issues and because of a lack of fabricators who are able to succeed at that level.
Real issue, the lack of, yes.
We just finished a project where we did not produce it ourselves, and it was, and that was the big challenge for us, is to determine how we were going to arrange to work with this builder, so that, or a builder, so that we would get the results that we needed. But I should explain it by saying that we we had a production system mapped out in great detail prior to contracting with a steel fabricator, with a builder. The project is what we call a tube steel caged shell. So it's 400 pieces of tubular steel that are all three-dimensionally bent with a CNC tube bender, and they all align along a shell surface to make a kind of something that's between a shell and a cage. And so we had defined and mapped out a production method that, to our mind, was pretty airtight, and you could but we went to talk to builders, and every time we talked to them, it was a kind of a test. And if they could, you know, produce in the course of several conversations an idea about building the project, having seen the drawings and not been privy to exactly what we had determined or what we had sort of thought through, if they could come up with something that was equal to or better, they were
welcome to it, right?
They were potentially up to the task, and we really only found one company that would do that, but then they could do it, and then in the agreements, the contracts, that was baked into the method, was baked into the contracts. So this idea that we're not responsible for the means and methods didn't apply. We hired them to specifically do something that was a little bit more like an industrial design project. It wasn't like a building project, you know? I mean, how exactly the contractor handles that wall might be different than another contractor, and they might be able to do it within the same construction set. But in our case, there really wasn't. It was like contracting an industrially produced object.
Yeah, this is something, it reminds me a great deal of this anecdote I always use, which was the first product I developed was a small steel cart. It had a few functions, you could sit on it and so on, but it was for an Italian firm. And at that time, my practice was in Boston, and it was my first project, so I really wanted to beat the manufacturer to the first prototype and produce my own prototype. So I had it done at a laser cutting facility in the kind of industrial belt that surrounds Boston. And when I picked it up, it worked, but it was ridden with detail problems, like 20 or 30, you know, they had sort of cut strange holes as reliefs for folding, and there were no nice little radii on the corners. Everything was sort of, I mean, they made protective shields for Humvees, so you could expect that kind of labor. But in any case, I kind of got on the plane and had my big list of all these things that we're going to have to troubleshoot when we get to Milan. And I got to Milan, and the Milanese, or the producer in Brianza, north of Milan, they had not only solved all of the problems that I had on my list, but they had already solved problems that I hadn't even thought of. And it was this craftsmanship and this, you know, I think that this myth that somehow industry is divorced from craft is such a farce. And I think, like Bill Zahner earlier spoke really beautifully about his staff, and I've been to that factory, and there are really skilled union workers that just have a craft, an industrial craft. And it reminds me, like, just the last thing I'll say about this was that in the 17th century, 18th century, around the time of Diderot's Encyclopédie of Arts and Industry, they would say that your city was only as cultured, or you could sort of gauge how cultured a city was by how badly it smelled. And the reason was because cities with culture had factories, they had tanneries, they had dyeing, they had metal work, and they were, you know, sadly polluting their rivers, but they had culture. And I think industry and culture and cities which have industry and are supported by industry are really vital for culture, for society.
But the Industrial Revolution is over, didn't you hear?
Oh, yeah.
We learned that today, didn't we? Bring me to another point. I'd like the group here to see if you dribble this one. Is that Jen Rumsey and Bill Chrysler spoke very beautifully about how their new technology and fabrication processes helped them towards responsibilities that were, in the end, quantifiable. They were either towards environment, they were about material use, efficiency, less waste with material brought to structure, more strength with less material, and so forth. I would like to ask you guys, in the opportunities inherent in new fabrication, including something we didn't discuss, which is the printing, 3D printing. Do you guys, how do you look at the non-quantifiable components of the act of design and architecture? The non-quantifiable, the irrational forces that you're solving, that the nuances, the intangibles that belong to the spirit of what we make. Remember Kahn's statement? It starts with a brick. It starts with an idea, a spirit, and eventually gets into a brick. But at the end, when the last brick is put into place, it better say that unmeasurable thing that you started with. Do you, in this relationship between the things that we use to assemble, build, and create the materiality that we surround ourselves with, this bubble of space we wrap ourselves with, we call architecture, or art, or sculpture. Do you see these methodologies helping you with feeling and pursuing the aspirations that belong to the irrational forces of design? You follow my...
Yeah, I think while we're all of us are deeply concerned about issues of fabrication, I think at the end of the day, it's super important that architects understand their role in relationship to technology is not the same as a fabricator, and it is not the same as someone whose interest is primarily technological. At the end of the day, we think that as architects, and I think everyone here would probably share this feeling, our role is as synthesizers of a lot of things in the world, and technology being one very important aspect of the work today. Just an example of that would be, we work a lot with metal.
I'm sorry, you
we work with metal a lot. Did I go off? No. Metal. We work with metal a lot. And we've worked hard to understand, from a technical standpoint, a lot about what metal brings. How tightly can we bend a radius? At what point does it crack? What are its structural qualities? How big should it be from a technical standpoint to be structural? But at the end of the day, those are just one small component of us understanding a set of architectural effects that come from having that intimate knowledge. Like, the architect at the end of the day is making a space where the technicalities make it possible. But to understand, for example, material effects, the amount of sparkle, how a radius would affect the way movement would occur, or the overall piece is understood aesthetically. That, at the end of the day, I think is what is important, not the technicalities that go into that. But you're never going to get to that without having a deep understanding of the technical issues.
It reminds me, when I got out of grad school, we chewed on theory in school a lot. We were force-fed theory. We felt like geese getting shoved full of force-fed theory. And it's all we talked about when we went to cocktail parties and stuff when we were in school. But when we got out and we're building, you went to a party of your colleagues, and you ended up talking about some subcontractor that knew how to do something that no one else knew how to do, and that's what you really mattered, because that's where the rubber met the road.
Yeah, well, one more thing. Why is it important that we do that? I think in order for us to preserve our, if we become technical guys, if our level of expertise is based purely in the technical, we're going to lose badly, because there are always going to be people out there who have the ability to understand it. I mean, we had experts up here who make us look like complete amateurs this morning. They're always going to understand those kind of issues far better than we can. Our role is of synthesizers of those things.
Amateurs discuss strategy and theory. Professionals and experts talk logistics.
Thank you. Well done.
That was from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
There's another issue. I'll call it, we're in a building assembled out of a lot of brick. It's not, well, on the one hand, that's not what's holding anything up. It's there's steel in there holding up this span. But the brick was assembled, the size of the brick accommodated what someone could pick up on a pallet in terms of a number for a row. and also what one hand could pick up and put into place, and carries that touch, I could call it, to the fabric and texture of a wall, a meaningfulness, you could say. And we saw some remarkable robotic assemblies that had tremendous texture, right? And I asked this question, is there something that you guys feel is digital touch? And I know, Jenny, you work at big scale, medium scale, and small scale. And you referred to the architecture of what you place around the body. If anything touches us, physically, it's going to be the stuff you're making. So how do you think about this thing of digital touch? Or is there such a thing?
It's a really interesting question, and I think that especially I didn't think about it this way of the kind of generation of us up here, and we have like 1 foot in the analog, 1 foot in the digital, and in some ways we're kind of bridging that transition, and the things that Dwayne was talking about, you know, the kind of the extra something, and I think of that whenever I'm working purely digitally. I mean, all my pieces are 3D printed. We design it in the computer, and you know, some people think you just press the buttons and spits it out. But there's a million ways to design with certain material property, and you know, how do you get the sparkle on, you know, the ring? That why wouldn't everybody else do that? And so then maybe the digital touch is still the kind of designer in us, in that like I'm designing these kind of knife edge chamfers that you wouldn't do if you were tooling, you know, a ring by hand. Because it like through this kind of knife edge, you're getting extra sparkles on the ring. I think that you can very much bring in all of those qualities. You just have to, you know, this kind of other foot in the analog is like you produce, you prototype, you understand the kind of results you're getting, and then you bring it back and you feed back into this whole digital process. So it's still very much for us a back and forth between the kind of end and the process. So.
We could take I've been given the red sign. So can we take a few more comments and close out? Yeah,
well, I think that you go back to your question about technique and mastery of technique, and how that relates. What other sort of intangibles come into play when one is making choices? I mean, you have to be, I don't know how else I would describe it, but you have to be in touch with some kind of, it has to have some kind of magic for you as a person, as a human being. For me, what I do, there has to be some sort of place where an idea and a visualization even of that idea, or a prototype of that idea, has to sort of reach escape velocity, and I'm like, yes, there's something about that I can't explain in purely technical terms. And I mean, that's not how I think about it, but it has to have, there's an emotional capacity or emotional aspect to it for me.
Yes, there should be for all design.
But architects need to be trained in that, and I think that schools can tend to fall into these sort of skills, become these sort of skill centers, which is dangerous.
We thank our audience, and we thank our moderators and our panelists from this morning. We break for lunch.